Economic Development, or the House and Senate Interim Economic Development Workforce Investment Committee meeting to order. I want to begin by thanking everyone for their hard work during the interim. We had what I consider to be a fairly ambitious interim, undertaking a number of important things, and I do want to thank folks. I want to recognize our staff here that have put in a lot of hours. Sasha Allen, Kirk Smith, Audrey Ernstberger, in addition to Andrew Mano and Drew Baldwin, who were with us for part of the interim. Andrew has departed this committee and gone on to another department in LRC, and we wish him well there. And he has been succeeded by Janine Coy, and we're looking forward to having her work with us on this committee. So again, I want to conclude by thanking everyone for their dedication and hard work to this committee during. It does make a difference in our records. So at this time, I want to ask.
We are on the top three locations to visit with Louisville Tourism. We're the top three that when they go out and sell to visitors and tours. So we get calls all the time in tour buses, and even, again, we're really small compared to what we'll be. Second thing is I want to mention we had a feasibility study done years ago, and what they determined is if someone visits a city for a reason, so a conference or a meeting or whatever, if there's a botanical garden, they stay a day and a half longer. So think of the hotel rooms, the restaurants, and all the other things, all the other money that they're spending because there's a botanical garden in that city.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. We have to give them a reason to stay.
Yep.
Representative Banta.
I just want to say I love this. Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, this is more of an educational question. Are you guys going to do any classes on the effects that the ground, being on a landfill, talk to kids about reclaiming it and what's in there, what you find? I'm just curious from a science perspective if that would draw some students in.
That would definitely draw students. We haven't gotten there yet. We are getting ready to do an educational display in our new building of things we found in the landfill. So remembering that was a neighborhood. And then when it was destroyed, everything was just kind of all the construction debris. But we've found shoes and baby dolls and army men and plates and forks. I mean, it's just kind of unusual, but we will display that. We've talked about doing some science classes about reclaiming, also the soils. How do you plant in soils like that, and how the soils have to be amended? So yes, there's a whole nother program. We haven't done that yet because we're starting at the lower grades other than volunteers, and we'll build to that. But I think there's a lot of adults and a lot of engineers that would be really interested in learning that too. So yeah, it's definitely on the agenda.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from committee members? Well, Casey, I want to appreciate you coming today and sharing the information. As I said, I believe organizations and entities such as yourself tie in closely with economic development because we bring people here. As you said, people stay, they spend money. That's what we want folks to do. We want them to come to Kentucky, make it a travel destination that they choose to come, not just happen to be by. And I think that the Botanical Gardens is an entity that will create that, and I'm looking forward to the growth that you all will experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us today. Yeah.
All right, maintaining the theme. Hank Phillips, if you'd like to come forward. We have at least one member that was on the budget subcommittee for tourism that heard a presentation from Hank earlier this week. I actually had invited him to appear before this committee a while back before I knew that he would be presenting before the budget subcommittee. One of the things that you will be hearing today is a request from the Kentucky Travel Industry Association for federal ARPA money that has been made available to Kentucky, and he is going to outline today some of the travel industry's goals and what the utilization of those funds would be for. These are monies that have been sent to the state. We have to use those. I have long advocated, and my 9 years in the General Assembly, that we don't make enough investment in tourism. I said the other week that it's required sometimes to spend money to make money. Other states around this nation that border us and are in close proximity to us spend huge amounts of money on tourism, and they reap the benefits from that. And Kentucky has not been in that category. And tourism is something that this committee has addressed before. A couple of years ago, we had the folks from the Lake Cumberland area come here. One of the things I like to do is highlight the gems and the positive things that we have in this state. So I've made my statement. Hank, I'm going to turn it over to you. Please introduce yourself for the record, and after you've done so, you can begin your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm Hank Phillips, President and CEO of the Kentucky Travel Industry Association. And I got to say, the lead up to this presentation from the Louisville Botanical Gardens, that was an awesome presentation. It's an awesome attraction. And Mr. Chairman, your comment, and others as well, about the connection between economic development and tourism, that is a point we always make. It's not one and the other. Tourism is economic development, and it's one of the very best forms of it. So we're so appreciative of your understanding of that and that of the committee as well. You had asked that we talk also about labor shortage that the industry is encountering, and I will cover that and then move on to the plan that you referenced and even one other subject that will be of interest to you. With the labor shortage, we have not been spared, as you would expect, and as you probably already know. In talking with our members prior to last week, and then especially last week during our Kentucky Tourism Annual Conference, the consensus is that the severity of the labor shortage is the only thing worse than that we're dealing with right now is the overall impact that the pandemic has had on our industry. And we know that we're not alone with the labor shortage. We've spent time talking about causes, talking about solutions, and over the course of this conference, there was a great deal of discussion, and there was a general session we held on the subject. So what I want to share some thoughts with you about that. The consensus in our industry, there are several points of consensus in our industry about the labor shortage. And again, I just want to stress that apart from the pandemic itself, the economic crisis overall that it brought on, the next most severe thing we're dealing with is exactly that, the labor shortage. It's not new. This industry has struggled with labor availability before the pandemic. The pandemic has made it much more acute. Virtually every business that in our association and that I've spoken with has increased their wages over recent months. We had a speaker from a major hotel chain, Best Western Hotels and Resorts, based out in Phoenix, actually. And she reported that Best Western hotels, just by way of example, have increased their labor costs from a low of 10% to up to and including 30% increases. So the businesses in our industry are doing what they can in terms of enhancing wages and trying to, it's an arms race out there right now as far as employers increasing wages, and they've been trying to keep up with that. One of the consensus points, and it wasn't necessarily expected, is that since the unemployment benefits, the enhanced or expanded benefits went away, there has not, unfortunately, not been a discernible increase in the availability of workers. That's a part of the multifaceted cause, we believe. We continue to believe that, but it has not moved the needle appreciably as those benefits went back to a more of a normal state. This is a statewide problem. We also know, and you all know, that it's a national problem as well. And as I've mentioned, there's multifaceted reasons for it. Not the least of which, and I'm going to borrow from the Kentucky Chamber's playbook. They spoke at our conference, and they've done excellent work, as I think you all know, in delving into the labor shortage in the whole workforce area. They point often and significantly to the low workforce participation in Kentucky. Unfortunately, we're 47th out of 50 states in workforce participation, and there's multiple reasons for that. Retirements, skill gaps, lack of access to child care, transportation issues, substance abuse. Just reading from their list, social safety net, the existence of the social safety net, which helps people who need help, but also at the same time for some other people may serve as a soft landing to where they don't go to work. And that cuts both ways. And incarceration and reentry issues are all in this mix. In our industry, child care is particularly a subject that gets discussed because child care issues disproportionately impact women. And in our industry, we're very proud that we have a large proportion of our workforce that is made up of women at every level of our industry, at the entry level up to the senior executive level. And so any issue that particularly affects women then particularly affects our industry, and child care is one of those as relates to the labor shortage. There's continuing COVID concerns as an industry that faces the public, interacts with the public every day. We've observed conditioning that folks also have gone through by being at home during the pandemic. They've adapted, they've figured out ways to readjust their households and the mechanics of their households to where in some cases work is not the necessity that it was for members of the household. And related to that is something else we've noticed, which is just kind of a reprioritization that some folks have gone through with their lifestyles. I'll give you a quick example. At our conference last week with the AV company that we had with us, I was talking to the on-site manager of that, and he was telling me that, and they are very affected by the labor shortage as well. He said, people in these jobs, the kind of jobs that they do, they used to kill themselves, figuratively kill themselves, early hours, late hours, event after event, day after day. And he said, people have decided that some folks, that they don't want to put themselves back through that grind again. And so they have looked for and found other opportunities. So there's this reprioritization of life and lifestyles that enters into this picture. So where do we go from here? A lot of what I've talked about are structural issues like childcare and transportation and the like, and we know that you all wrestle with those every day. And God love you for it. And I know it's tough to address those kind of public policy issues. We don't just look to you for solutions, though. We look to ourselves. Some of the things that we're going to be delving into is we are really good marketers, really good. That's what we do, and I'll be talking more about that in a second. We need to do a better job of marketing the jobs in this industry, the opportunities, the career paths, the upward mobility, which is a hallmark of this industry. If you ask 10 executives in the tourism industry how they got to where they are, They would say they began at the bottom rung and worked their way up. They started young at the bottom rung, fell in love with the job, the industry, and worked their way up. We need to market that more than we do. We need to understand that the good people who work in our industry already are overworked, exhausted, frustrated, and because they're doing 2 and 3 jobs instead of the one they were hired to do. We need to be sure our managers understand that and relate to that, and that we have management practices that deal with that. We also need to be aware that this it's not just the pandemic, it's not just labor shortage in terms of filling positions. We need to be mindful of the retention of employees, because that's an issue as well. Retaining those overworked employees, helping them work through those days, work through the issues that stand in their way. We need to help them deal with customers. Bad behavior right now is not just limited to people on airplanes. As customers, guests, and visitors encounter limited services or slower services, that's a challenge for that employee who is dealing with that customer. And another aspect of retention is that there's opportunities out there. Everyone's looking for employees, and so it's easy to move from one place to another. So that's kind of a summation of what we're dealing with in terms of workforce. We want to help ourselves in the ways I just mentioned. We look to you as much as you can on some of those broader public policy issues that contribute to the labor shortage. Now, there are 2 specific areas I want to mention to you where legislative action will not only help us work through the labor shortage, but in the larger picture of the recovery of this industry, which is still far down the path. Full recovery is not upon us. And so a couple of proposals to help us get there and to come out the other side more competitive and stronger as an industry than we've ever been before. That is an opportunity. I'm going to speak to what is the lesser of these 2 initiatives, although it's very important. Let me start with a kind of a blueprint. Whether it's recovery and more competitive, or whether it's addressing labor shortage, it starts and ends with revenue for our businesses. And how do they get revenue? It's from customers, guests, visitors, and increasing numbers of those. And how does that happen? It's through tourism marketing. That it's through, you heard reference to Louisville Tourism. That's the Tourist Commission, the Convention and Visitors Bureau in Louisville, that helps be sure that visitors and people who are thinking about visiting know about the botanical gardens and all else there is to do in Louisville. So that tourism marketing is essential, and in order for it to be effective, that needs to be funded sufficiently in order to be effective, and in order for those businesses ultimately to gain that revenue that they need. So 2 things. First, there's a lot of money being left on the table, unpaid, that should be coming to tourist commissions at the local level, and it's transient room tax, the local lodging tax funds. That's the primary, across the state, that's the primary source of how these tourist commissions have marketing funds, their source of marketing funds. However, there's a segment of the lodging industry that is not doing its fair share of paying those taxes. It's the short-term rental folks, the Airbnbs, the VRBOs. Many of them don't even understand they owe these taxes. Some of them don't view themselves as being lodging when they are every bit a lodging or accommodation source as is that traditional hotel down the street. Now, to their credit, Airbnb has entered into some agreements with larger cities to pay that and other local taxes. Airbnb has also a few years ago entered into an agreement with the Department of Revenue to pay the statewide lodging tax that is the source of marketing funds for the Department of Tourism. However, across the rest of the state, these tourist commissions that depend on these funds are not receiving them from the short-term rental folks. So we will be bringing forward legislation that will address that will plug that increasingly large leak in the tourism marketing funding bucket. Basically, it will be that Airbnb and all the others will pay on behalf of their local operators the local transient tax. Those funds will come into, as we envision it at the moment, those funds would come into the Department of Revenue to be then distributed out to the local jurisdictions where those monies belong in the first place. It's modeled after a Tennessee bill that has been passed and has been in place for, I think, about a year now. So that's one way to help ultimately drive more revenue into our businesses and help them deal with recovery, advancement, as well as with the labor shortage. The other one is, and you have our handout, and this is the big one. This is a game changer for this industry. It's our Tourism Recovery and Investment Plan. As the Chairman indicated, $75 million we are requesting from the American Rescue Plan Act funds. That act specifically cites tourism industry as an impacted industry that these funds exist for, as an eligible recipient of these funds. We are requesting monies to enhance the state's marketing of Kentucky. We are requesting funds as well, as you can see in that handout, funds to go to, on an allocation formula basis, to the tourist commissions to supplement their work locally, marketing their communities. For example, Louisville Tourism to market botanical gardens and all the other things that are in Louisville. And then throughout the state, the tourist commissions. And then thirdly, the money is needed to revitalize the meetings and conferences and conventions sector of this industry. In a decimated industry that is struggling to gain traction, the hardest hit part has been the meetings and conventions and conferences part. So we've targeted some funds expressly, again, through the tourist commissions to go to them. In our handout, you'll see methods of accountability. We are serious. We know this is a lot of money, and accountability is a predominant consideration in our request for those funds. And that includes the methods of allocations and the uses of the funds. We've tried to be very intentional about those. I'm going to leave it at this to say that this is an awesome industry in its own right, but in the benefits of tax revenue and the benefits of jobs, in the benefits of economic activity, all of which accrue to the people of Kentucky, to the families of Kentucky. Us working together have an opportunity to make Kentucky what it always has been capable of being, which is an absolutely front-of-mind premier destination. We need to get up off the mat. We need to become stronger, more productive, and our Tourism Recovery and Investment Plan will help to get us there, and we request your support of that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to take questions.
We do have some questions.
All right.
I want to lead off with a question on the Airbnb legislation that
Yes,
you
sir.
were talking about. It's my understanding that you have worked with the overriding organization for Airbnbs. Are they in agreement with proceeding down this road?
They are.
Do I have that correct?
Yes, sir. I'm so glad you asked that, because it's important to understand. We always want to know, you all always want to know, now where's the opposition going to come from? What's the basis for the opposition? Actually, it was Airbnb that got in touch with me because we've worked with them on and off over the years to try to resolve this. And they are who contacted me to tell us about the Tennessee legislation, which they supported in Tennessee, and said, when you all are ready to roll in Kentucky with this, we will support you on that. It works for them. They haven't tried to avoid this tax. It's been a practical issue of how to get it into the local hands. And so, yes, sir, they are supportive of this.
We'll begin our first question with Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. We don't have your handout about your appropriation request, but as soon as we adjourn, I'll go upstairs and download that and read every single word. I can promise that.
All right.
For that $75 million, how do you anticipate distribution based on population, amenities in those areas?
Right.
I just want to make sure our rural friends aren't overlooked in that.
They definitely will not be. There's those three components. So the first one is funding to the Department of Tourism. So that would just be a straight line appropriation to the department for their marketing of Kentucky. The second part, $35 million for tourist commissions. That would be through a formula very similar to a formula that's already in place with another program called the Tourism Marketing Incentive Plan. We've tried to, whenever possible, we've tried to use or propose what's already in place rather than reinventing the wheel. So the central element in that distribution to the tourist commissions, and that's the one you would be most interested in given your question about ensuring rural and smaller community inclusion, would be based on the economic impact of tourism in each county. So each county, using 2019 numbers and generally using a formula that has been working for everybody, it would be a fair and equitable distribution using that formula. Oh, and the third part for the meetings and conventions part. Now that's where, depending on the community, we call it depending on the destination. When it comes to meetings and conferences and conventions, all destinations are not necessarily created equal. There's venues and so on that enter into the picture of who can really rev up their meetings and conventions. So for that, we have proposed a competitive grant program so that the Department of Tourism can create criteria in this program and help make the determination of where the return on investment will be the greatest for those meetings and conventions money. That doesn't preclude smaller places. Small meetings are what's going to get this whole situation moving again. But that will be a more targeted, competitive approach on that third component.
May I follow up, Chair? Yes, you may. Thank you. I'm encouraged to hear about the formula. The tourism industry is a major driver in my small rural Kentucky counties. My follow-up question is, do you anticipate there being protocols, requirements of how that money, that distribution can be spent?
Yes, and let's, again, trying not to reinvent the wheel. There's a statute that governs how the department spends its 1% transient money on marketing. That same statute, we are proposing that it's very basic and fundamental, but that it be the basis for how the department spends their portion of these funds. With the middle part, the money going out to the tourist commissions, I mentioned the Tourism Marketing Incentive Program. All right, it's a different kind of program, but there is a long list of allowable uses of funds that's in regulation right now.
Perfect.
We see that as the basis. Well, let's just take that list that's working and apply it to these funds. And that way we don't experiment, we don't recreate. We know what we're doing and we know what we will be doing. Also, what that also does is, instead of having this funds over here that already exist and funds over here under a new and different set of rules, we can bring that together into a seamless, comprehensive marketing approach rather than it being sort of divided into two pieces.
Very, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. And Representative King, their proposal was a one-page. You may have had that in there. We did provide that for you, and I hope all the other members have that as well.
We'll be sure that everyone gets it. We'll circle back to you. We'll be doing that anyway. If I might, let me also mention informationally, I know you all receive daily a tsunami of emails, but one thing we've started doing is something we call it trip notes, and we send it once every 2 weeks to every legislator where we talk about this plan from its different angles and aspects. And so if you see trip notes in your mountain of emails, I would kindly request you take a look at it, because there'll be information there that'll continue to help you see what we're shooting for with this plan.
I would also encourage each member of this committee to reach out to your local tourism folks. I did that with our director in Bullitt County just to get an idea of how the requested appropriation for counties would affect those entities. I met with my director. They're currently getting about $18,000 a year for promotion in their county under this proposal. Bullitt County would receive $613,000 to promote local tourism and events in your community. So I'm going to encourage each of you to reach out to your local folks and try to get a number so that you're aware of how that would benefit your communities to promote themselves in the tourism. Our next question is Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Phillips, thank you so much for your presentation. The area that I represent, we're blessed with some industry, but we are heavily dependent on travel and tourism. And one of the things that the chairman was speaking about earlier was about how economic development and tourism tie together. And something I was unaware of until just a couple of years ago is that site selectors, one of the top 5 things they look at when they're looking for a place to locate their business is quality of life. And we are blessed with immense resources and natural beauty and lakes and mountains and so many things that we need to highlight. And I appreciate the work that you've done on this, and I truly believe it could be beneficial to our communities. And, who knows? It could lead people to come here and travel and visit our lakes, our cities, and decide they want to make this place their home and bring their businesses here as well. So thank you so much for this presentation.
You're so welcome. If I could follow up very quickly, because there's an untold little story about that whole quality of life and the tourism fitting into it. We're also proud of the work the General Assembly did, the governor, everybody did on the Ford announcement of several weeks now ago. Something I didn't even realize at the time was that the local team in Hardin County that hosted and toured and informed and educated the representatives from Ford SK included the Elizabethtown Convention and Visitors Bureau. They helped with tours. They did presentations to these waves of the different Ford teams that came into the area, explaining how wonderful life is in Hardin County, explaining what the opportunities are for the families and the kids and all. And they were directly involved, as were many, many other people. Don't want to take anything away from anybody else. But tourism, in that way, played a role in that mega decision. And that's just one example of how that can happen.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you, Hank.
See you.
We've talked a couple of times now, so I appreciate that. Just wanted a statement and a question, if I could, Mr. Chairman. Tourism and travel really is a critical aspect of Kentucky as a whole, and in Owensboro, my region as well. And for example, just recently we declared, we claimed the title of Bluegrass Music Capital of the World in Owensboro. So I'm excited about that. So I think that people should come see the Bluegrass Museum and Hall of Fame and see why we're the capital of the world. And while you're there, maybe take a tour of one of our distilleries. And, of course, when you're at the distillery, you're probably going to sample a product. And I wouldn't want you to be on the road having sampled one of our products at a distillery. So I would say stay at one of our riverfront hotels right next to our convention center. Enjoy the evening. And if you want, go over to Brasher's Little Nashville. Enjoy a show at Brasher's. Come back to the hotel. Have a nightcap. Enjoy the bridge lights and the riverfront view that you have. and enjoy Owensboro. And Mr. Chairman, I'll save day 2 of my itinerary for the next time. But now that I've concluded my commercial for Owensboro, I do have a question.
Because then you'll talk about barbecue, right?
Yes, sir. I left out barbecue. You got to eat dinner somewhere, so Old Hickory, Moonlight, either one would be awesome.
I'm here for you.
So now that I've concluded my commercial, my serious question. We talk a lot about return on investment when we're talking about requesting funds. And I know it's in your flyer. I know it's in your one-pager. But for the record, could you just talk a little bit about what you anticipate seeing for a return on investment for the $75 million that you're asking for?
It's hard to get real literally specific. Way we think about it is in 2020, the tourism economic impact declined $2.9 billion. We're asking for $75 million to get back $2.9 billion and more, and we're absolutely convinced that that we will be able to do that. I know that in a few years back there was a study done that showed that for every dollar of marketing funds that were invested, $15 came back. So I'm not sure that exactly precisely answers your question, but there's no doubt that there is a major return on the investment of tourism marketing funds.
Well, I think it's critical that we recognize there needs to be a bang for the buck. And I think that the tourism industry and the travel industry can provide that bang for the buck for the monies we give to you.
And we can and we will, and in our proposal there is in each case reporting that will be done on the use and the results of these funds.
Very good. Thank you, Hank. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have 3 more questioners, and we'll get to those 3, and then we need to move on to our next topic. Our next question is Representative Beckler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have questions on 2 areas, briefly, if you'll allow. Thank you. Hi, Hank. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, sir.
It's been a while, a couple days anyway. Huh?
All the way back to Tuesday.
Yeah, all the way back. Question number 1. Is any of the money that is being requested going to go to the waterfront that we just heard about?
Not directly, no. There's, and I'm glad you asked that, because in the development of our plan, I mentioned this on Tuesday. In the development of our plan, the first question we asked back in March when the American Rescue Plan Act was passed, we said, okay, tourism is in there. We know we need and can greatly benefit from these funds. So let's start thinking about how and what to propose. And one of the early questions was, should we distribute funds directly to the businesses that make up our industry? And the answer, our conclusion was no. That would spread things so thin and be of limited impact, limited duration. So that's why we focused so much on marketing. However, whether it is the state marketing Kentucky or the Louisville Tourist Commission, Louisville Tourism, certainly a major attraction that will be marketed going forward is the Botanical Garden. So that's how these funds relate to a wonderful place like the Botanical Gardens.
Thank you. Next question. You mentioned the bill that you hope we will pass, like the one in Tennessee.
Yes, sir.
There are other organizations in the same general area as Airbnb. Do you intend in that proposed legislation to address those organizations as well?
Yes, sir. This would speak to all such short-term rental platforms. It's not a bill targeting Airbnb specifically or per se. It would be in any entity that falls into that short-term rental category would be included.
Would something like Uber be considered in the short-term rental?
No, sir, not as
okay.
Not as that would be transportation. I'm sorry. This is focused on retrieving the transient room tax So it would be focused on short-term rental in terms of lodging and accommodations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sheldon.
Thank you. I feel like I need to call you Hank since everybody else has.
Just don't call me Henry. That's what my mom called me when she was mad at me.
Good deal. To kind of circle back around, you made a very crucial point in the beginning, and your point was workforce participation and your workforce is the biggest issue that you have as well in the state of Kentucky. We're fighting that all over. And I'd just like to make a comment about that. Prior to the pandemic, workforce participation was really bad as well. I think in the Bowling Green, Warren County area, I want to remember it was 6,500 jobs needed to be filled prior to the pandemic. Now we're at 7,900. But and then of course skill gaps. We were talking about reasons why we're having this workforce participation. You talk about skill gaps, child care issues. We've had child care deserts for quite some time, been dealing with that, and I think effectively we're trying to work through some of these things. Skill gaps with the community colleges, we've been dealing with that for a few years. So I guess what I'm trying, and I know that all came from the chamber, and I listened to that, and I agree with every bit of it. But if one would think, what's really changed? Why we had a lot of these problems before. You didn't go up to businesses and have a sign saying, don't have any staff. We have to close today. What has actually caused us to go over the edge? Where are we at? And one of the things the chamber mentioned, and so did you, is a social safety net. So I just want to say that while part of our problem was us too much entitlement, whether federal or whether it's state. We've had stimulus checks. We've had tax credits. We've had child tax. We've had a lot of things that we needed. But I think what we're experiencing is that if you give people that opportunity for too long of a time, you get this what you were talking about, people kind of getting used to it and saying, if I can get this entitlement, maybe I can figure it out, not go. So how do we fix that? I think right here, we have to point out that I do believe in the free market. I believe that we'll all come back, but I don't think we will unless we understand that things like extensive Medicaid expansion, where people are literally having their health care, their food stamps, their child tax care, stimulus money. There's so much that's happened, and we can't undo that. But I want to encourage at least myself and maybe you too. I do believe that while you haven't seen a lot of change since we've stopped some of the unemployment stuff coming in, but there's a lot of other things that need to be brought back into balance. And I do believe the free market will correct all this. It's just I think while when we give artificial stimulation to this economy and we drive inflation up like we have, now we see businesses closing up everywhere. Our small business community is and then that becomes development. That's related obviously to tourism and travel. And so just when they were talking about the botanical, I do a lot of development. I couldn't wait to get down there. I'm thinking hotels, fast casual, fitness. There's a lot of good things around that botanical garden. Be great. But you got to have the workforce. So I'm going back to what you said. It's the biggest thing since COVID, the COVID concerns, and hopefully we'll all pray that's going behind us, and right. Let's all work together. And I appreciate your presentation, but I just couldn't help but pointing that out. I appreciate you pointing it out. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'm not going to weigh into those difficult issues, except we know there needs to be a social safety net. We know that. And I'm saying the collective we, but in all things there has to be balance, and that's the tough part. And that my heart and my mind goes out to you all, because you all are the ones who have to, from your differing perspectives and districts and all, you all have to focus in on those things and say, what's the right balance? And
well, I'll finish with this.
Appreciate your efforts with that.
And I appreciate this. Let me just I agree 100% with your thoughts, and I would just say a job is probably going to be the best social safety net that we can put out there. So why don't we all work together on that? Thank you.
And we certainly have that solution ready to go.
All right. Thank you.
And our final question for Hank is Senator Southworth.
Thank you. Do you know how much the current marketing incentive budget is total that we put in for all the local commissions?
That that program I was referring to, which is actually a matching funds program. Again, we're not proposing these monies to be matching funds, but if your question is for the program we were using kind of as a model for the distribution and the uses, that's $2 million spread across the state. And that's not the only money those organizations receive, but that program specifically, the funding amount of it is $2 million.
Is it 50-50 match?
It varies. It is for certain things 50-50, but for other things, it's a 90-10 match. The state matches 90%. The department does. There's certain designated uses of the funds that they try to incentivize with a much higher match than other broader uses. But I do want to be clear, what we're proposing is not a matching situation. Just the uses and the type and the distribution is what we're referring to.
That's fine. No, I was thinking when the chairman mentioned talking to your local commissions, I was thinking of one of mine, gets like $2,000 a year. And
in the matching funds, right?
Yeah. And so the numbers, his number was astronomical to me.
Yeah. And one thing,
I just think that it's a lot more than maybe I was thinking. And so I'm looking for, what is the sweet spot in marketing can have a ceiling. There are those TV commercials. People go, oh, no, not that one. So is this money where we write the check and then they have it to use whenever, or is this going to be tied back to every expenditure back to the federal government reporting inside their time frame?
If I'm understanding the question, I might not be, so straighten me out if I'm not. But the use of these funds within the parameters of allowable uses, the determination, as it is with all funds a tourist commission receives, would be the precise application of the funds. What are we going to invest in this magazine versus this digital advertising versus other strategies? Those determinations would be made at the local level by the tourist commissions. Did that answer your question?
My question was, if let's say somebody gets 600 whatever thousand, Bullock County gets 600 some $1,000, do they get one lump sum check from the federal government to the tourist cabinet?
No, they would get it from the General Assembly has the authority to appropriate those funds. As I understand it from Senator Thayer, who is drafting the appropriation language, the appropriation would be, as with other ARPA funds, the appropriation, I think, would be from in the budget by the General Assembly.
Mr. Chairman, my question to follow up is the reporting, because ARPA funds have to be used within the designated time frame, 2024, 2026 if they're already allocated. So I'm trying to get a handle on, do our tourist commissions have to spend all of this money by 2024, or once they get the lump sum check, we can send the report to the federal government, say it's been sent to tourist commission, and then they could use it for 10 years.
Right. I think that the use of the funds has to be done within that ARPA time frame.
Okay, thank you.
But that's an excellent question. We need to. I need to get you a better answer than the one I just gave you. And one other thing I want to say really, really fast, and that is the formula for the precise formula for distribution hasn't been determined. And even though we think it needs to be based generally similarly on one that's in use now, it's a little, I don't want to call it dangerous, but it's a little tricky in terms of managing expectations before we know what that formula will be, managing them up and down as to exactly how much the 30, and remember it's 35 million as we've proposed it to go out to the tourist commissions. So what, for any single tourist commission, what that number might translate into is still in the to be determined realm due to the exact formula needing to be determined. So it's a little bit of a guesswork. So I would suggest proceeding cautiously as far as trying to arrive at some kind of a number, because what I can tell you is that, as I've already mentioned, that Tourism Marketing Incentive Program has $2 million in it. We're proposing, for the same general formula, $35 million. So you can sort of do some general fuzzy math, but that doesn't necessarily get you to an exact number per tourist commission.
In the final end, it does provide additional resources to local.
Amen, and that's the
to local
plan.
tourism.
That is the plan, absolutely.
Hank, thank you for the presentation
So-
today. I think we had a good, robust discussion today,
Yes.
and I'm glad to have that. We are now going to move on.
Okay.
to
Thank you
our-
all very much.
Absolutely. We're now going to move on to our final presentation today. Josh Crawford, the Executive Director from the Pegasus Institution. Josh, if you'll come forward, introduce yourself, and then Josh will be talking about workforce issues today, and go ahead and jump into your presentation.
So, Josh Crawford, Executive Director, Pegasus Institute. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I want to thank you for having me here today. I promise you that I am remarkably cognizant of the fact that I am the final speaker at the final meeting, and so I will be very respectful of your time. I've followed the work of this interim committee some over the interim period, and you've had the opportunity to hear from a number of folks on a number of worthy topics related to unemployment insurance, job training, things that are generally thought of as ways to improve economic development and labor force participation. It is my hope, though, this morning to discuss other macroeconomic conditions and their impact on labor force participation, as well as provide a little bit of background on Kentucky and national trends in labor force participation. So Representative Sheldon stole a little bit of my thunder on this already, only because while the task before you is Herculean because of the time period that we have just lived through, unfortunately, Kentucky's starting point as it relates to labor force participation was not a particularly good one. So beginning in the early 1980s, 1981 in particular, the United States labor force participation rate and Kentucky's labor force participation rate began to separate from one another. The national rate began to improve, while the Kentucky rate was stagnant or declining. By 1988, Kentucky had a labor force participation rate 4.5 percentage points lower than the United States rate. Again, that was due largely to increases in the U.S. rate, while Kentucky's rate was declining or flat. As a sort of an aside and a note, labor force participation has generally been declining, both in the United States broadly and in Kentucky since about 2001. That is not a linear trend. There have been instances of improving labor force participation rates since 2001, but as a general trend since that time period, labor force participation rates nationally and in Kentucky have been declining. For most of the last decade, Kentucky's labor force participation rate has been between 3 and 4 percentage points lower than the U.S. rate. In February of 2020, the last full month of data unimpacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and associated lockdowns, Kentucky's rate was 4 percentage points lower than the national rate. By June of 2020, that difference had grown to 5.4 percentage points, and that difference has largely held since. In September of this year, that difference was 5.1 percentage points. So there's a growing area of academic intrigue in the relationship between economic freedom and labor force participation. And so, first and foremost, defining economic freedom is important. So, broadly speaking, economic freedom is the ability of individuals within a society to take economic actions, which is obviously very broad, but has some very real policy implications. Studies routinely find that there is a positive relationship between economic freedom and labor force participation. And there have been several state-level analyses, the most comprehensive of which looked at state-level data from 1981 to 2009 and found that greater levels of state economic freedom were associated with lower levels of unemployment and higher rates of labor force participation. So the Fraser Institute, which is a public policy think tank in Canada, regularly publishes the Economic Freedom in North America report. It gives aggregate scores in economic freedom to every state. It also does this for Canadian provinces and Mexican states because it is the Economic Freedom in North America report. But for our purposes, the United States index is the most relevant, obviously. It breaks overall economic freedom down into three subcategories: government spending practices, taxation, and sort of regulatory practices. Over the last decade, Kentucky is consistently ranked in the bottom quartile, but has been steadily improving its score since 2010. In 2010, it had an overall score of 4.69. That is out of a possible 10. In the most recent report, which was just released earlier this week, which uses 2019 data, there's a 2-year data lag in their work. Kentucky emerged from the bottom quartile for the first time this decade, was ranked 37th in the country, and had an overall score of 5.60, so almost a full percentage point increase over that 9-year period. We've historically lagged both the nation and surrounding states in both labor force participation and economic freedom. And research suggests that Kentucky lagging in both of these is no accident, but the two are actually related. And so I would implore this committee and members of this committee, when thinking about questions of labor force participation and workforce, to not merely think of the things that are generally thought of as related to economic development and workforce. When you think about tax policy, think about your workforce. When you think about regulations in the workplace, think about workforce. When you're thinking about occupational licensing, think about workforce. These things matter, and they matter to the environment that is created in your state. And Kentucky, unfortunately, has a fair bit of work to do in this space. We have additional research on some of those sub-areas that if there is particular interest among committee members, I'm happy to provide those. I did not want to provide hundreds of pages of white papers for you all this morning. But if you have interest in particular issues, I'm happy to provide those. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Our first question is from Representative Bojanowski.
Thank you very much. When I pulled the paperwork for this presentation last night, I was very intrigued because I've never heard of this index. It wasn't something covered during my coursework for an MBA at U of L, not in economics, not in international finance. It was not covered in any of the coursework that I did for a PhD in entrepreneurship, also at U of L. So I was intrigued. What is it? So I went to Google and I pulled a couple articles, and one article declared that these rankings are nonsense. And so I looked at, I wasn't familiar with the source, and they probably lean as far to the left as the founders of these rankings lean to the right. So I tried to find a more balanced view. I did find an article that had more of a discussion on how this index was created and founded, and had a discussion about the global measure, and that in the global measure, it excludes political freedom and democracy in the index. And so Hong Kong is at the top of the list. And a concern there is that an authoritarian government that protects free markets is preferable to a democratic one that redesigns them. So now my interest is really trying to figure out what does all of this mean. And so I did find an article that was about the national rankings, the national index, which you're discussing. And according to this article, this index is not able to predict a state's economic growth. And a state such as California, which is consistently ranked near the bottom of these rankings, outperforms many of the high-ranking states, including Utah, as far as their GDP. So I'm not convinced that this is a measure that is impactful for economic development in Kentucky. But to go to the point of your presentation today and the impact of this ranking on the workforce, my understanding is a significant reason for our decrease in workforce is women who have left the workforce. Mm-hmm. How will reducing subsidies for childcare, decreasing minimum wages, reducing union membership, many of the aspects that improve your ranking on this, how will that increase participation in our workforce for workers who are already in Kentucky? I don't understand.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question, Representative Bojanowski. There are a number of studies that I did not include in the one-pager that you have in front of you that I would be happy to provide that actually speak directly to the question of women in the workforce. And there have been a number of studies that are not the product of the EFNA report, but that are sort of academic journal studies that look specifically at the question between female employment and economic freedom in the workplace. And of course, as with this issue and any other, when dealing with questions of economies, there are multifaceted reasons why economies perform well or do not, right? It would be malpractice on my part to come here and say that a single economic indicator could save the state in one way or another. California is a much larger, remarkably more diverse economy than we are. But generally speaking, and not just in the EFNA report, but in a number of academic journal studies, states with greater levels of economic freedom have higher levels of labor force participation, and there are causal reasons for that. Again, it's certainly not exclusive, but as a general trend among states, that is a truism in the technical literature on this subject, and it's true for women as well.
Thank you. I would look forward to reading that research.
I would be happy to provide that.
Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Crawford, for being with us this morning presenting. Thinking about economic freedom, over the years I worked in small business and I saw a number of people who were moving to the state. My question was always, why here? Why do you choose small town Kentucky from various parts of the country, large cities at times? And sometimes the answer often came back is there are more government benefits here in Kentucky. I can get more. And can you be clear on that? Is that one of the things that contributes to our workforce participation rate? Because in recent weeks, I've had conversations with people on EBT, the SNAP benefits. And it's found out it's very common for people to carry balances of several $1,000s in SNAP benefits, which it seems like a lot to me. Mm-hmm. And they have no incentive to work when things are so easy. So could you be clear on that? Is that one of our contributing factors to our workforce participation rate being so low?
Yeah, I think there are a number of contributing factors that are somewhat unique to Kentucky. The first and the most clear is the nature of our economy. We have a disproportionate number of folks who fall into job categories that were harder hit over the last 18 to 22 months than some other states do. We have a larger percentage of our workers in service industries and things like that, for example. We have a smaller percentage of our population overall with things like bachelor's degrees and in less resilient occupations, fewer occupations that could go truly remote and still work. But questions of government transfer payments, subsidizing sort of not working, and the impact of those. There was a conversation with the last gentleman who presented about finding that balance between creating a safety net that is appropriate because we don't want our fellow citizens to go hungry, but at the same time not creating an environment that disincentivizes work. I think we are living through a time period that will force us to reevaluate those questions in a number of ways. And there are a number of studies that have looked at that question specifically. I don't know about Kentucky specifically, but I'm happy to take a look at that and provide that research if it exists.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Representative King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. Does this index or your research, can you give me a definition of economic freedom? What actually does that mean? Maybe a few examples.
Sure. So that index looks at a number of factors, and the sort of three subcategories are taxation. So you're talking total tax burden, everything from property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes. Regulations cover everything from occupational licensure to workplace regulations, things like that. And government spending primarily focuses on what was just talked about, which deals with transfer payments and social safety net programs, things of that nature. They, on their website, which I believe is provided in the one-pager, go into much more detail on what all exactly goes into their particular indexing.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Cantrell.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is very similar to a couple other questions that have been brought up, and I'm glad when you made your presentation, you're kind of looking back about 20 years. We're getting a big, solid picture of things, and the metrics that you just talked about when responding to Representative King's question, the big things, government spending, government taxation, government regulation, all exist at some level everywhere, and sort of there's you can focus in on those details and sort of proceed accordingly if you wanted to rank, for example. My question is, what about some of these other things that are being brought up by some of my colleagues, and then I sort of made a little list too. Like you said, we're living in really interesting times. I actually wrote down that you said just lived through, because I'm not as confident that we're in the past tense on that yet.
Fair enough.
But I'm glad you are. I'm glad, it'll be a few years probably before we'll know when this sort of ended. But I wrote down some pandemic related, and I wrote down some of what my other colleagues mentioned about what I see and hear as really immediate workforce participation barriers. And I know you've been in front of this committee and other committees talking about some of these issues as well. And I'll just name a couple of them. The sheer number of deaths from COVID, we're at around 700,000 in the U.S., 10,000 in Kentucky. Some of those were members of the workforce, and those are people who have permanently left the workforce. Representative Bojanowski talked about, and everybody's talking about right now, women leaving the workforce, and childcare issues. I think those are linked pretty well. Baby boomer retirements, huge, right? Huge. I'm thinking about my parents who they don't need to work, financially, but they're, at least my dad for the next few weeks is still under 65. And, but they have permanently left the workforce. Mm-hmm. And we have that's a whole huge age group in our country, and something that we'll be grappling with for a while in terms of workforce, I think. Lack of lawful immigration status, reform, people who are in our state and counties right now who would do anything you asked them to do, but they couldn't pass an I-9. Mm-hmm. Representative Sheldon brought up the skills gap. Representative Baker brought up benefits. I know you've been in front of our committee numerous times talking about second chance employment and expungement related issues that can all get more people in the workforce. What about those things, and how do those fit into this conversation that I feel like we're having today, but we're not having in a lot of depth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, The only one that you just mentioned that I think from a statistical point that I would take issue with is the actual COVID deaths themselves, just because that tended to be a population who was far older, already out of the workforce, and so the statistical impact there I don't think is overly significant. Everything else that you spoke to, though, I absolutely agree with, and in some ways, this gives us the opportunity to talk not just about where we are today on workforce issues, but because Kentucky has for so long lagged the nation on workforce issues, why that might be the case and what can be done to remediate that, right? Second chance employment, obviously a huge part. Getting women who want to re-enter the workforce back into the workforce. There's some very interesting work on what percentage of women who left the workforce intend to go back at all or are perhaps happier in the circumstances that they are. The baby boomer exit was sort of looming over the country for a long period of time, and this probably exacerbated it and sped up some of that exit from the workforce. But millennials are the largest generation on record. They should theoretically be in the workforce at higher levels than they are right now, and that should be able to make up for some of that baby boomer exit. So all of those things are super relevant, and in some ways, part of my goal in being here today is to have you all and your colleagues think about workforce questions outside of just questions of whether a company comes to Kentucky or whether a job training program is successful or whether a specific set of transfer payments is a disincentive to work, but that so many of the policies that you touch that touch the economy more broadly touch questions of labor force participation. This will seem like a small example, but it's a particularly relevant one to both Kentucky and the COVID-19 pandemic. Restaurants and restaurant owners were particularly hard hit by this time period. Restaurant closures are particularly high. Opening and operating a restaurant is a relatively capital-intensive process. What is not a relatively capital-intensive process is owning and operating a food truck. But the ways in which opening and operating a food truck in the Commonwealth of Kentucky are significantly more difficult than they are in some of our surrounding states and some of the states across the nation, red, blue, or otherwise. And so for a population that has in particular dealt with or has been particularly hard hit by this time period, that could be an avenue of relief for them that, again, isn't the result of a transfer payment program, isn't the result of a job training program. They've already got the skill, but there are some artificial barriers erected to getting that person back into the workforce in a meaningful way. And there are examples of that sort of across industries.
Yeah, you're so right about that. Thank you.
Sorry. Any other questions coming from members of the committee? All right. Josh, thank you for your presentation. Appreciate it. Appreciate you coming today. All right, members, if you'll note item number 6 on the report on our agenda, we do have reports that this committee's received. They don't require any action or discussion today. As I said earlier, this concludes our meeting, our final meeting of the interim. We will be looking forward to a healthy agenda as we begin the 2022 session. I believe our committee will still continue to meet on Thursdays at 8 a.m., so those that need to prepare themselves mentally, please begin doing so now. Before closing, I want to wish everyone on this committee, our staff, and those that are here today, wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And at this moment, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. We have Representative Lockett, Representative